Coming up, America's best ally in the Middle East.
When you look at who are the local fighters with whom we can work, the only ones who have proven commitment and capability are the Kurds.
Columbia University's David Phillips discusses the past and the present of the Kurdish people and the fight against ISIS. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It is a pleasure to welcome David Phillips to this Public Affairs Breakfast program. As the author of The Kurdish Spring, A New Map of the Middle East, David is here to provide a much-needed history of the Kurds and to also explain why this ethnic group is evolving into a political community that is having a major impact in the Middle East today.
I'm very pleased to talk about Kurdish issues, which are front and center in the news almost every day. It was not always so. Discussion about Kurds was few and far between, but these days we're increasingly looking to the Kurds in Iraq and Syria, and even Turkey and Iran as strategic partners. The events since ISIS invaded Iraq point to the importance of the Kurds as partners of the United States. 27 years ago, an Iraqi gunship circled the village of Halabja near the Iranian border and dropped a toxic cocktail of mustard and sarin gas. On March 16th of 1988, 5,000 Kurds perished. I was introduced to Kurdish issues soon after, when a Kurdish doctor based in Maryland, a neurosurgeon who's now the governor of Kirkuk, came to my office and brought photos of the chemical weapons attacks in Halabja. Well, soon after that chemical weapons attack, I visited Halabja, and I interviewed the survivors of that attack, and that made a very deep and indelible impression on me and has motivated me to stay involved in Kurdish issues over now more than 25 years. What I've learned about Kurds is that they have a history of betrayal and of abuse. When Mark Sykes and George Picot sat at the table in 1916 and established the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they carved up a map of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East without regard for Kurdish interests. President Wilson repudiated the role of great powers in arbitrarily establishing nation states. Wilson championed the idea of self-determination. That principle was enshrined in the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which codified agreements at the Paris Peace Conference. As far as the Kurds were concerned, Sèvres established a commission made up of British, French, and Italian representatives, charged with developing a scheme for local autonomy and also establishing a process by which the Kurds could petition the League of Nations for independence. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rejected Sèvres, launched a war of independence, and Sèvres was rewritten in Lausanne. The Treaty of Lausanne was finalized in 1923, and in Lausanne there was not a mention of the word Kurd or Kurdish. Weary from many years of war, the great powers decided that their interests lay in a peace agreement with Turkey, and Kurds were divided among 4 countries. There are about 34 million Kurds in the world today, and they are the largest stateless people. They're divided between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Lausanne launched a period of tragedy for the Kurds. In response to Lausanne, Sheikh Said Piran launched a rebellion in Turkey in 1925. He declared an independent Kurdistan on Turkish soil. Turkey responded with an iron fist. It launched a Turkification program. Names, education in the Kurdish language, cultural festivals were all banned. The very existence of Kurds was prohibited. Rather than refer to them as Kurds, they were called Mountain Turks. And a series of laws were implemented, further constraining Kurdish expression and Kurdish rights. As a result of this harsh treatment, the Kurds established the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. They launched the Siverek and Hilvan rebellions, which were really targeting feudal landlords who were in the pay and service of the government. In response, Ankara launched a major military operation in 1989. Up to 4,000 villages were destroyed and 3.5 million people were displaced. The civil war between the Turkish authorities and the PKK, which has been ongoing until just a couple of years ago, claimed up to 40,000 lives. Likewise, the Kurds in Iraq suffered a similar fate. With the independence of Iraq in 1932, King Faisal committed himself to a pan-Arab approach. In response to that, Mullah Mustafa Barzani announced the creation of an independent Kurdistan called the Republic of Mahabad on Iranian soil adjoining Iraq. The Kurds were victims of the Cold War. They were eventually thrown out of Iran. When they went back to Iraq, they were massacred by Iraqi forces. When Ba'athist overthrew Prime Minister Qasem, they launched a counterinsurgency campaign against Iraqi Kurds. And between 1961 and 1970, about 100,000 Iraqi Kurds were killed. This conflict ended with the creation of an autonomy agreement that promised self-government to the Kurds, but the agreement was never implemented. And the armed struggle resumed again in 1974. The Kurds were pawns in a greater game. With the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein believed that the Kurds were aiding the Iranian forces, and he launched something called the Anfal campaign. The chemical weapons attack in Halabja was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader campaign that went on over more than a year. Anfal in Arabic literally means the spoils. During this Anfal period, during which a security cordon was established between Iran and Iraq, it's estimated that 182,000 Kurds were killed and 4,500 villages were destroyed. After Sheikh Said's rebellion in Turkey was suppressed, many Kurds left the southeastern part of what had then become Turkey and resettled in Syria. And they created something called the Shoybun League in 1927, which literally means in Kurdish, one who controls their own destiny. Their goal at the time was independence from France. Just as in Iraq, the Kurds in Syria became victims of pan-Arabism. After the Suez War of '56, Nasser created the United Arab Republic, which joined Egypt and Syria. This was a failed experiment, but the Kurds paid a price nonetheless. In 1962, there was a population census, and 120,000 Kurds in Jazeera, which we hear about now because it's a major combat area in the civil war in Syria, were registered as aliens and stripped of their citizenship. 300,000 Kurds were denied identification cards. And then, to make matters worse, in '73, a security buffer was formally established along Syria's border that stretched 300 kilometers and 15 kilometers deep. And as part of the establishment of a security buffer, 140,000 Kurds were forcibly relocated. The Adana Agreement of 1998 between Syria and Turkey required Syria to list the PKK as a terrorist organization and to evict Abdullah Öcalan, who was the head of the PKK, living on Syrian soil at the time. Öcalan fled. He went from country to country in a rather dramatic odyssey, and he was ultimately apprehended in Nairobi. Ilter Türkmen, the former foreign minister of Turkey, told me that US intelligence played a great role in delivering Öcalan. In his words, he said, "The US delivered Öcalan to us as though he were a pizza." Likewise, in Iran, the Kurds suffered a similar fate of denial of their identity and rights. They supported Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution in exchange for promises of greater autonomy, but they were never really trusted by the Shiites and the Ayatollah's inner circle. Most Kurds are Sunni. They didn't participate in the drafting of a constitutional convention, not because they didn't wish for a role, but they were denied one. When there was a referendum to adopt the Constitution that was passed with a 98% support, the Kurds didn't participate. So they launched a rebellion, Within a couple of years, 10,000 were killed and 200,000 displaced. Thousands were executed by the Ayatollah's regime. Linked to the PKK, they launched something called the Free Life Party, which is Pajak, which was instigated at after Öcalan's arrest. The adoption of the Transitional Administrative Law in Iraq in 2004, which decentralized power from Baghdad to the regions, served as an inspiration to Kurds in all four countries. Kurds looked across the border at what their brethren in Iraqi Kurdistan had achieved and said they wanted the same. So when we look at this period of betrayal and abuse, we should also recognize that by the end of the 20th century, there started to be a shift in Kurdish fortunes. Oil was being developed in the Kurdistan region. It's estimated that there are 45 billion barrels of oil there. After the Gulf War, when Saddam launched counterattacks using helicopter gunships, Kurds who remembered Halabja fled to the mountains. 1 million of them crossed the border into Turkey. The US and the UK implemented with Security Council authorization Operation Provide Comfort to rescue the Kurds. That morphed into something called Operation Northern Watch, which was a no-fly zone for northern Iraq, north of the 36th parallel. So the Kurds were able to establish a de facto independent state starting in the early 1990s. I remember visiting Sulaymaniyah in 1992 to address the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan's annual convention. And in my keynote, I called for bourgeoisie, azadi, and democracy. Democracy, freedom, and human rights. All the Kurdish tribal leaders were wild at my remarks. They thought I was an emissary of the president and that I was there to promise them something that they had always dreamed of. The next year I visited Erbil for the conference of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, and I called for the establishment of a US consulate in Erbil. At the time, everybody thought I was crazy because that would imply some kind of de facto recognition. Of course, now we know there is a consulate in Erbil, and US diplomats are there in large numbers. So the Kurds were able to make the most of this opportunity. We provided them security. They started to build institutions. They started to rebuild their economy. But they are still a part of Iraq. And as Iraq became increasingly dysfunctional after the Iraq War, Baghdad and the Kurdistan regional government became more and more polarized. With the election of Nouri al-Maliki's Dawa party in 2006, Iraqi society was deeply polarized on sectarian as well as ethnic grounds. And the Kurds essentially suspended their cooperation with the government in Baghdad. They would still show up for meetings, but they really wouldn't participate in the business of governing. Meanwhile, Iraq descended into a civil war. But the Kurds continued to make the most of this opportunity. And it seemed as though they were well on their way to independence. And then the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria suddenly emerged on the scene. They stormed across the border in Mosul on June 10th. In fact, Kurdish intelligence knew that they were going to attack. They went to the Obama administration, they went to the Iraqi government, they forewarned that this was about to happen, and their warnings were ignored. ISIS seized Mosul. We all know that the Iraqi army turned tail and ran. It seemed as though they would be content to own Mosul. There was an understanding reached between the ISIS commander and Masoud Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan regional government, that they would not attack the Kurds. They swept south as far as Samarra, the site of the Golden Dome Mosque. They were within 25 kilometers of Baghdad, and then they were stopped there. Instead of stopping and consolidating their gains, they pivoted and they attacked Iraqi Kurdistan. And the much vaunted Peshmerga, who are the Iraqi Kurdish fighters, a term that literally means those who stand before death, fled their onslaught in Sinjar. And in fact, they abandoned the Yazidis there to terrible atrocities. ISIS came to within 28 miles of Erbil, the capital of the Kurdistan region. They took a town called Mahmur. The road between Mahmur and Erbil, which I've traveled many times, has no obstacle. And with all of the armor and the equipment, they could have made a mad dash into Erbil. There are 1 million people in Erbil. There are large US corporate and energy interests there. We have a consul general in Erbil and American diplomats who are there. The Obama administration made a decision that it could not allow to happen in Erbil what had happened in Benghazi. Up to that point, it had insisted that it would only intervene once Iraqis came together and after their election removed Maliki and established a government of national unity. Well, its position was quickly overtaken by these events. And the US launched airstrikes that prevented ISIS from advancing into Erbil. The Peshmerga regrouped and stopped their advance. So the initial response of the US government when Erbil was threatened involved preventing ISIS from seizing more territory. But in a classic example of mission creep, the US involvement expanded. We all remember in August stories of Yazidis on Mount Sinjar. It was estimated that up to 40,000 Yazidis were stranded on the mountain. So we launched a humanitarian operation. We were dropping water and food supplies to the Yazidis, but we needed to get them off the mountain. It was in fact the PKK and the PYD, the Syrian Kurds, who opened a humanitarian corridor that allowed the Yazidis to escape. They did that with the close air support of US warplanes. So what initially was a mission to prevent the advance of ISIS turned into a military mission to prevent further genocide against the Yazidis. And then it morphed further into a campaign to regain territories. Supporting Kurdish Peshmerga, we launched airstrikes that allowed them to retake the Mosul Dam. We've supported Kurdish Peshmerga in their efforts to retake villages around Mount Sinjar. They successfully did so. They also liberated Mount Sinjar. What they found there were stories and images of terrible atrocities that had been committed against the Yazidis. So our approach to the Kurds and to Iraq and Syria was constantly evolving during this time. You remember when asked by a press corps member about the US policy towards ISIS, the President Obama famously announced,
"We don't have a strategy yet."
Well, that was not the kind of statement that inspired confidence among our allies or among those who were on the front line trying to defend against ISIS. So he announced on September 10th a strategy for dealing with ISIS. He declared that the US would degrade and destroy ISIS, and he explained that we would do that using air power, which had been tested and proven to be effective, in conjunction with local fighters, and that we would rely on a multinational coalition of countries, frontline states, and other NATO allies and friends to address the ISIS crisis. There's a flaw in that approach. When we talk about local fighters, to whom are we referring? There's much conversation about the Iraqi army's capabilities and whether or not they have the commitment and capacity to retake territory. So far, they haven't demonstrated that they are able and willing. When we look at operations in Merli or the operation in Tikrit, it's not the Iraqi army that's involved. It's Shiite militias identified with the Iraqi armed forces. In Diyala province, where villages were liberated by Shiite militias, there were terrible reprisals and atrocities committed against local Sunnis. So if part of our vision for preventing or draining the swamp of support for ISIS involves getting the Sunni tribes back on board, supporting Shiite militias who go into villages and clean up, certainly not consistent with what we hope to accomplish in the long term. So when you look at who are the local fighters with whom we can work, the only ones who have proven commitment and capability are the Kurds. They were able to defeat ISIS's advance. They were able to retake territory in the Mosul Dam and in Sinjar. And it's not only the Peshmerga who have shown capability. What happened in the small city of Kobani is an extraordinary tale of heroism that deserves great commendation. This Kurdish city on the Turkish-Syrian border was besieged by ISIS. ISIS said that they would make a point of going into the city and killing all of its Kurdish defenders. By the way, 40% of the defenders of Kobani were women. So the People's Protection Units of the PYD, the Syrian Kurdish Party, fought valiantly. But they were no match for ISIS. ISIS had 80% of the city. Up to that point, the US kept consistently saying Kobani has no strategic value. Well, we recognize that it may have had no strategic value militarily, but it had enormous symbolic value. So we launched airstrikes against ISIS positions. We did that after they'd already entered the city. Had we done that before they came in, it would have been an entirely different field of battle. We also airlifted weapons to the Syrian Kurds over the objection of President Erdogan in Turkey. In fact, in his response to the events in Kobani, Erdogan likened the Syrian Kurds and ISIS, saying they're both terrorist groups and there's no difference between them. In fact, what ISIS succeeded in doing is bringing Kurds together in a fashion that had never happened before. You had the People's Protection Units from Syria. They were joined by the PKK in large numbers, Pajak forces from Iran, and also the Peshmerga. 155 came in with sophisticated weaponry to relieve the city. And ultimately, ISIS was defeated there. More than 1,000 ISIS fighters were killed in the Battle of Kobani. They had staked great reputation, and their recruitment was based largely on an ability to seize Kobani, make it their own. The liberation of Kobani was a huge strategic setback for ISIS, and it demonstrated that the Kurds, not only in Iraqi Kurdistan, but in the region, would prove to be our best allies. So our approach in the Middle East needs to be to work with our friends rather than to placate our adversaries. There's an adage that Kurds always quote: Kurds have no friend but the mountains. Well, today, in the post-ISIS period, the United States has no better friend in Iraq and Syria than the Kurds. And we should reevaluate our alliances, we should reconsider our support, we should refocus our resources, and we'll find that the Kurds are not only pro-Western, secular, they are able and committed. On the battlefield and in the boardroom, the Kurds are able partners of the United States.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what the risks are for the Kurds with identifying with the U.S. to the extent you've described when they remain vulnerable in all those countries where they're living?
There is a danger. They are and will remain vulnerable. The only country to call for independence for Kurdistan is Israel. Both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Peres have done so. The Kurds live on a razor's edge. They have few friends. They have been friendly towards the United States, although we had betrayed them repeatedly throughout history with the Algiers Accord of 1975, when Bush 41 urged them to stand up and rebel against Saddam, and then left them alone to face reprisals. But they are still adamantly pro-American and pro-Western. I must say that much to my dismay, that special strategic relationship has diminished this past year. The Kurds sought more from the United States than we provided them. They're deeply grateful that we came to their rescue, saving Erbil. But our reluctance to give them the weapons they need, to give them the training they require, and the diplomatic support that they desire, raise serious questions among the Kurdish leadership about Washington's reliability.
Would it be possible for Kurds in the different countries where they live ever to unite in a Kurdistan?
So like any pluralist people, there are factions and differences. They come from different tribes, they have different languages, they have different histories because of the way borders were constructed. So they are united when under duress. When they're not under duress, Kurds tend to go their separate ways. Kobani was an exception. I said before that ISIS succeeded in doing what no Kurdish leader had ever done, bringing all these Kurdish factions together. ultimately, I don't believe that Iraq and Syria are viable states. I think that Iraq will cease to function. It will implode. The Arabs in Iraq will continue their conflict, and Kurds will seek recognition, either from Baghdad or through some kind of coordinated declaration of independence. That's not likely in the near term. The Kurds are not going to announce a unilateral declaration. Unlike Kosovo, the US isn't going to lead a coordinated declaration. And as long as Baghdad is dysfunctional and the government in Baghdad is a proxy and representative of Iran, which opposes Kurdish independence, we're not going to see a negotiated outcome between Erbil and Baghdad. So my recommendation to the Kurds is that they need to start behaving more like a state rather than like a tribe or a militia. That means transparency over their oil revenues, fighting against corruption and nepotism, creating a banking sector, diversifying their economy, allowing democratic governance to flourish more than it has so far, so that when the opportunity arises for Kurds to negotiate, not fight their way for independence, they have shown that they are committed and capable of managing their own affairs.
David, at this critical juncture in the history of Kurds in all the Middle East, thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Jerry.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.